So this talk has zero technical content, but it's a talk I like to give at conferences. Who's heard of Queen Boudica? A smattering of you. So Queen Boudica is the glorious and tragic warrior queen of the ancient Britons, of Iron Age Britain, and her story is a really interesting story of myths and legends and propaganda. So I'm going to tell you a very, very brief version of her story, mostly inspired by a friend of mine called Dr. Natasha Harlow, and she actually works as an archaeologist on the Caister dig in Norfolk, which is where Queen Boudica supposedly comes from, and she's the world expert on the artifacts found at the Caister dig. Okay, so about 2,000 years ago, Iron Age Britain, the ancient Britons lived in Britain, which will probably come as no surprise to you. What came as a surprise to the Britons of the time was the arrival of the Romans. Now, the first time they came, we saw them off. Julius Caesar, I believe, Veni Vidi Vici, is that right? I came, I saw, I conquered, I scarpered pretty quickly, because those ancient Britons were pretty good warriors, particularly with the sling and the ranged weapon. But then, so the story goes, they developed new military technology, namely the turtle, with the shield wall in front and ahead and behind, and with that they could get close to the Celts. I don't like calling them the Celts because apparently the word Celt and Celtic, if you're an anthropologist, has no real meaning. So we're going to call them the ancient Britons. Anyway, so the Romans came and they did conquer, and they ruled Britain for quite some time. And the way the Romans used to rule was alongside the existing power structures. They would essentially go into villages and towns and say to the chiefs and the leaders there, you're now going to enforce our rules, our laws, the Pax Romana, and if you don't, we will kill all of your people one by one until you do. So by and large, the subjected populace did that. Now, according to Tacitus, a Roman historian contemporaneous, at that time lived in an area of Norfolk, and I forget the Roman name for the Iceni people. Tacitus called them the Iceni people, and their queen was a warrior queen called Boudicca, and she ruled, according to Tacitus, this region of ancient Britain. And some of the Roman centurions of the time, apparently they abused some of her daughters. And so Boudicca raised up an army of 100,000 Celtic warriors, ancient warriors, and they marched on 3 cities at least, Verulamium, which is now called St. Albans, Londinium, which is now called London, and somewhere else, I forget entirely, and razed and burnt them to the ground, killing the Romans. The Romans at the time, the Roman legion, about 10,000 soldiers, they were in Wales, and they were busy slaughtering the Druids, the ancient religion of the Britons, of which no records remain except for the story told by one traitor Druid who gave up all his secrets to the Romans. So the Romans were busy slaughtering the Druids. It took a week for the message to get from London to the Roman legion, and they marched to attack the Celts. So you have 100,000 bloodthirsty, victorious warriors fighting for their freedom and their survival, and you have 10,000 experienced but battle-wearied Roman legion. And so the story goes, they met somewhere along the road that is now called the A5, a road that has somewhat haunted my life. It's a totally different story. And so the story goes that these two armies, they met in an area that was densely wooded on either side. And the ancient Britons, they had their chariots, their supply chains, their horses behind them. But because they were in this densely packed area, they met as effectively 2 lines. And the way the Romans would fight at the time, they had swords, they had shields. The front line had their shields in unison, and they would move forward, stab, move forward, stab. And then with big hobnailed boots, they simply marched through the Celtic army. And so the story goes, around 90,000 Britons died that day. Queen Boudica herself escaping and then killing herself because she'd lost her people. And this story Tacitus records and goes into history, and is part of British culture, British history, British identity, our great warrior queen. There's a minor problem with this story. Absolutely the only evidence that it happened, as Tacitus says, is the writing of Tacitus himself. And we happen to know that the Romans are terrible liars. Julius Caesar wrote of his great glorious conquests in Gaul and told the most outrageous fibs. So what really happened? Well, there is some evidence that the Celts sacked and burned Londinium, Verulamium, probably several times. However, there's no evidence that Queen Boudica ever lived. The idea of 100,000, an army of 100,000 soldiers marching across Britain is simply preposterous. That would be, if 90,000 Britons had died in one day, there would be a record of a mass die-off in the archaeological record. There is evidence of other mass die-offs. Preceding the Iron Age, there was thought to be a mass die-off in Britain, about 90% of the population. And those Celts who originally marched across Europe and found their way into Britain came in, but rather than conquest, came into largely unoccupied land. So what did happen? Well, my friend's theory is something like this. We know there was an uprising, several uprisings. And if you're an occupying nation and the occupied country rises up and nearly kicks you out, that's not a good story to get back to Rome. That's not a good story to get back to the surrounding occupied nations. So how about this one? Their glorious, tragic warrior queen leading an army of victorious soldiers, outnumbering the Romans 10-1, meet a battle-weary 10,000 soldiers. Oops. Sorry about that, and I will finish very soon. 10,000 soldiers and win. To outnumber 10-1, they win. If that story gets out to the other occupied nations, are they going to uprise? So the only historical record we have, the writings of Tacitus, fake news from the Romans. But we still love our glorious warrior queen, Queen Boudica.